So I've been following a story from New York City, from Staten Island, about a police brutality case that's provoked a lot of anger and got quite a lot of attention, and rightly so. It concerns a 43-year-old African American man um, by the name of Eric Garner in Staten Island, and there's a lot of videos online. I've seen a number of them. I've looked at a number of resources because I didn't want to just sort of react immediately. I wanted to try and get as many angles as possible on this before commenting. So basically, this man was being questioned by the NYPD for the offence of selling individual cigarettes, which is apparently considered a minor quality of life infraction. This term, quality of life infraction, if you don't know, is a term that's used in New York. It was introduced in the Giuliani years, when Giuliani was mayor, as a way of tackling sort of crime in New York City. When Giuliani became mayor, crime levels were very, very high in New York, and it was this notion that you tackle minor crime to scare the big criminals, sort of thing. So this man apparently was violating that. Well, I've watched a few things. I've watched the video footage of him being clearly taken down in a chokehold, and about 4 officers wrestle him to the ground. Now, he's a big guy, but you clearly have 4 officers wrestle this man to the ground. He clearly says he can't breathe several times. He's clearly very uncomfortable, but you can make out him saying he can't breathe. There's plenty of videos for it. Just type into YouTube Eric Garner. Now, there's a lot of things that are clearly troubling about this case, and I was furious a minute ago, so I had to calm down before I made this video, because police brutality always pisses me off. It's always something that I find very hard to accept. But basically, they claim he was resisting arrest. Now, in America, resisting arrest is basically questioning why you're being arrested is equated to resisting arrest. Now, I watched the video, and he was basically asking why am I being questioned? What have I done wrong? He didn't seem to understand what the problem was. Now, if this is a felony, I don't know the laws in New York. If it's a felony, then obviously he shouldn't have been doing it. But clearly, it was a massive overreaction from the NYPD. Initially, it looked like the officer was quite calm and it was just one officer, but then other officers appear out of nowhere, and suddenly this guy is tackled to the ground. You could tell by his voice, he's quite nervous. You have 4 guys. I counted at least 4 officers tackling him to the ground. One of them, I can't remember if it was the first guy that initially spoke to him, has him in a chokehold. Well, what happened was he was rushed to hospital afterwards, and he died. So the NYPD has the blood of this man on their hands, and they're going to have to come up with some bloody good answers for this. But I've just watched a press conference with Mayor de Blasio and Bill Bratton, who had been New York Police Commissioner before, and who's just been reappointed by de Blasio, who's just become mayor. Now, de Blasio has promised to reform the NYPD to improve their relationship with New Yorkers, and of course New York has had history before of tensions between the community and the way officers act, and New York isn't unique. There's been many examples of police brutality cases in the United States leading to serious tensions, sometimes ethnic tensions. I don't want to bring that into it, but it's just a fact. And by the way, I'm not saying there's any ethnic dimension to this. There's no evidence of racism, but there's clear evidence there of police brutality. And I've just watched a press conference, and de Blasio came across as quite sympathetic. Bratton started off by talking about how much of a tragedy it was, but I was disgusted. At the end of his sort of statement, he came out with what could only be described as excuses about the deceased resisting arrest. Now, that sort of callous attitude, I mean, if the widow of that man that must be so hurtful to hear those sort of. I think Bratton should be ashamed of himself for coming out with that sort of statement and basically making excuses. Now, supposedly the officer responsible has been put on desk duty, and this is the aspect of police brutality that angers me the most. You know, if anybody else was to commit common assault and someone would then die from their injuries, they would be arrested for manslaughter. Yet there is quite obviously a situation here where there is one rule for the police and another rule for everybody else, and that is an absolute abomination. Now, Bratton says there's a criminal investigation going on, but basically he was making excuses towards the end. I'll put a link to that video, judge for yourself. But it sounded to me, he started off by coming out with predictable sort of, oh, it's a tragic situation and we didn't want it to happen and this sort of thing. But in the end, he just comes out with a lot of excuses. And I think that's an absolute abomination. It shows that Bratton doesn't give a shit. My impression there, from his body language and his attitude and his rhetoric, is they're only bothered about being caught out. De Blasio sounded a bit more sincere, but generally it was a case of, oh, well, it's a tragedy, but, oh, our officers face tough situations, so it's whatever. And it really sounds like, I mean, they're saying we need to see the whole situation, but it's pretty crystal clear. There's plenty of videos. It's not like this is just one video. There's lots of different videos circulating around that shows it from different angles, and every single one of them, it doesn't show the victim being aggressive. It doesn't show him attacking anyone. Yeah, he's being defensive. He's saying, why are you always harassing me? But he's not showing any signs of violence. He's unarmed. It's, you know, we're not talking about a gang member who's threatening the police with a weapon. We're not talking about a violent thug here. We're talking about an unarmed man who was committing a very, very minor offence, a harmless offence, and who, I mean, they were saying, you know, the police have to act on calls, okay, but act with 4 officers tackling a man to the ground? I'm disgusted, quite frankly. And I think I'm going to try and follow this case, see what the outcome is. If there is any democracy in New York City, then the officer responsible should end up in jail, because a man is dead. And what bugs me is the fact that supposedly chokeholds are prohibited by the NYPD. Now, Bratton was saying, oh, we're going to investigate our training procedures, but that only suggests that the officer responsible must be absolutely stupid or is just willfully ignoring this law. Well, if it's not a law, it's clearly something they're not meant to do. If it's prohibited by their own statute, then what does that indicate? It indicates that they don't give a shit. This is similar to officers in London hiding their badges when they rough up protesters. And it's just a classic example of, I mean, how can you misunderstand something like that? It's not difficult. If you're not meant to chokehold, then don't chokehold. You'd think it would be black and white. I don't know why that is hard to understand. I mean, you'd think, well, the way Bratton was talking would be like, he's talking about officers like they're children who... So, I'm pretty pissed off. I had to collect myself in order to make this video, because these cases always make me so angry. Because it's not necessarily the fact it's happened, it's the attitude to it, and the fact that the officer responsible has just been put in desk duty. He's been stripped of his firearm and his badge, but that's about it. And I would not be surprised if it ends up in a whitewash and he's just put off duty for a few months. Because there's so many examples of police departments dealing with police brutality cases in that sort of way. Now, a man's life has been lost. If the NYPD doesn't want anger to boil up and this to turn into something very ugly, which is always a potential, then they should take this very seriously and accept due process, and accept that if this officer is found guilty in a court of law of manslaughter, he should be in jail. Because a man has died basically for selling cigarettes. And that is basically the definition, as far as I'm concerned, of a police state. You could find something like this happening in countries like Egypt and China. And I'm not exaggerating. The situation of police brutality in the United States of America, in my opinion, is so bad that it is comparable to a police state. Now, America is different in one regard, in that it is reported, and that's a great thing. To be fair, news networks do pick it up in the States, and they do report, and tough questions are asked. That is good. But there is a situation, which I think is an utter disgrace, whereby even questioning why you're being arrested is considered resisting arrest. I heard one pathetic apologist come on the video and say, oh, he sounds like a resistor. A resistor. I mean, that's the sort of mentality. And that's another thing that bugs me. Idiots who go out of their way to make excuses for this sort of thing. Let's be clear here. Of course the NYPD face difficult circumstances. I'm not going to trivialise their job and say that they have an easy job. Of course they don't. And I'm fully aware that they do have to deal with hardened criminals and gangs and so on. But not in this case. What you had here was an unarmed man who wasn't showing any signs of violence, who was simply questioning why he was being stopped by the police. That's all he was doing. Now, why could the officer involved not have just explained that and said, you know it's illegal to sell cigarettes like this? But instead it's this very, in my opinion, sinister silence, and then suddenly the guy is pounced on. It's a very sinister situation, because it shows that basically American citizens are at risk from these sort of out-of-control thugs wearing a uniform. And unfortunately, decent officers are going to be tarred with the same brush. I'm not going to sit here and say all American police officers are like that, but unfortunately the more this happens, and the more it's treated with this sort of contempt by the authorities, then I think there is going to be a growing situation of distrust between the public and the police. And America's not alone, but it's just that it's, in supposedly the greatest country in the world, this is a glaring problem. There's many, many other examples. Now, this is a particularly bad case because a man has died, but there's many other examples where people are harassed, where they are beaten, where they are suffering when they really don't have to, when they're not hardened criminals, when they're not thuggish gang members. Because you have egomaniac people, I was going to say men, but sometimes it's women as well, abusing their position and just doing... It absolutely infuriates me. I honestly believe that there's people out there who think that when they put on that uniform they become like Robocop and they could do whatever they want. And this sort of sick mentality needs to change. Of course they need to be tough people, and of course they need to be prepared for dangerous situations, but it was quite obvious, if you look at the video, that this man was unarmed. It was pretty damn obvious. So Bratton's excuses are just a joke. I mean, he starts off saying it's a tragedy, but if you look at that video, if you look at the conference, he ends up just making excuses and almost blaming the victim. And I think that's an absolute... it's disgusting. It's like rubbing salt into the wound of that man's widow. De Blasio was a bit more humane in his approach, but it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of this is. I'm not saying the officers should be, like, just send him to jail like that. There should be an investigation. Give him due process. But what infuriates me is that it's quite obvious there is one rule for the police and another rule for anyone else. Say I get into, for the sake of argument, say I get into an argument with a guy and I punch him, and he trips over and falls and hits his head on the roadside and he dies, then I would be arrested for manslaughter. And rightly so. A police officer puts a man in a chokehold, the man later dies. What happens? The police officer is put on desk duty, like it's a small thing. Now, Bratton says there's a criminal investigation ongoing. Well, I bloody well hope that there is some outcome to that. I'm sorry for the language, but I'm very angry. Because it's not like this is a one-off. It happens very frequently in the United States. I'm not saying every case there's a death, but this sort of thing happens way too much. And of course it's not just America, so if anyone thinks I'm picking on America, it's not like that. It's just that, you know, supposedly the greatest country in the world, this is a serious problem. Britain's slightly better, but we have had this increasing in recent years, especially from the Metropolitan Police. And David Cameron wanted this guy, Bill Bratton, to be Metropolitan Police Commissioner. I mean, it's my understanding that he played a big role in reducing New York crime levels, so clearly he knows something about crime. But that still doesn't justify his attitude to police brutality, which is clearly a disgrace. I'm going to leave it there because I'm just going to rant and say the same things over again. But I'll put a link to the video conference. You can judge for yourself. And if you want to see angles of this, the victim's name was Eric Garner. He's a 43-year-old man from Staten Island. Complete disgrace.